The first thing she said to me was that it was lonely here, and somehow those 4 words echoed louder than the machines keeping my father alive. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, and the digital clock on the wall blinked 1:17 a.m. like it was counting down to something none of us wanted to face. I had been sitting in that stiff plastic chair for hours, watching the steady rise and fall of my father's chest, when the night nurse stepped quietly into the room and broke the silence with a voice that sounded far more fragile than I expected. She wasn't talking about the hospital wing. She was talking about herself. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this exist because people like you still believe that even the smallest act of compassion can change a life. Her name was Morella Ashcroft, and she looked too young to carry the kind of exhaustion written across her face. The badge pinned to her lavender scrubs said she had been working at the hospital for 8 years, but her eyes suggested a lifetime. She had a gentle way of moving, careful and deliberate, as if she had learned that life could shatter without warning. That night, the hospital felt different. The day shift had long gone home, the visiting hours were over, and only the quiet beeping of monitors and distant footsteps filled the air. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered faintly against the dark sky, but inside that room, time felt suspended. My name is Armin Velez, and until that night, I thought I understood loneliness. My mother had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with illness, and my father, once a towering presence in our home, had slowly grown smaller with every doctor's visit. When he collapsed that morning at our breakfast table, the world shifted again. By afternoon, he was in intensive care, and by night, I was sitting beside him with nothing but fear and regret in my chest. There were so many conversations we had postponed, so many apologies left unsaid. Morella checked my father's vitals with steady hands. She adjusted the IV, made a few notes on her tablet, then paused beside me. The overhead light cast soft shadows across her face, and I noticed how she avoided looking directly at the empty chair across the room. It was meant for family members, but no one else had come. I didn't have siblings, and most of our relatives lived in other states. The room felt too large for just the two of us and a man who could no longer speak. She finally looked at me and said, almost apologetically, that it was lonely here. Then she asked if I would mind talking until morning. At first, I didn't understand. I thought she meant talking to my father, keeping him company. But she pulled the extra chair closer and sat down, folding her hands in her lap like someone waiting for permission to exist. She explained that the nights were always the hardest. During the day, there were doctors making rounds, families arguing in hallways, children crying, volunteers handing out coffee. Daytime was busy and loud and distracting. But at night, the hospital felt like a forgotten island, and she often felt like the only person awake in the world. I hesitated. My chest was heavy with my own worries. I didn't know if I had anything left to give anyone. Yet something about her request felt urgent, almost desperate. So I nodded. The first hour passed slowly. I told her about my father's stubbornness, about how he insisted on mowing the lawn himself even after his doctor told him to take it easy. I told her about the small hardware store he had run for decades, about how he remembered every customer's name and always gave children a free lollipop from a jar behind the counter. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't just filling the silence. I was remembering who my father had been before illness turned him into a patient number on a chart. Morella listened intently, occasionally glancing at the monitors, but mostly watching me. Her eyes softened when I described how my father taught me to fix a leaky faucet, how he stayed up late helping me build a science project volcano that never erupted properly. The more I spoke, the more the room seemed to warm. Around 3 a.m., the hallway grew even quieter. The vending machines down the corridor buzzed faintly, and somewhere in the distance, a baby cried before being soothed. Morella finally shared a piece of herself. She told me she had once wanted to be a teacher. She loved children, loved stories, loved the idea of shaping young minds. But life had intervened. Her mother fell ill during Morella's first year of college, and medical bills piled up faster than hope. She switched majors, enrolled in nursing school, and started working nights to cover expenses. By the time her mother passed away, Morella had already committed herself to hospital corridors and midnight shifts. She said she didn't regret becoming a nurse. She had held hands during final breaths, celebrated unexpected recoveries, and whispered encouragement to patients who felt invisible. But she admitted that sometimes, after hours of comforting others, she would drive home at dawn and realize there was no one waiting to ask her how she was doing. Her voice trembled slightly when she said that. I felt something shift inside me. I had been so consumed by my own fear that I hadn't considered the weight carried by the people who stand beside us in our darkest hours. Morella wasn't just a nurse in lavender scrubs. She was a daughter who had lost her mother, a woman who had quietly rearranged her dreams, a human being who needed someone to listen back. As the night deepened, our conversation became less about illness and more about life. I confessed that I had always planned to move to another city, to chase bigger opportunities, but I stayed close to home because my father needed help with the store. Sometimes I resented that. Sometimes I wondered what my life could have been. Saying it out loud felt like betraying him, even as he lay unconscious beside us. Morella didn't judge. She simply nodded and told me that loving someone and feeling trapped by responsibility can exist at the same time. She said guilt has a way of convincing us that complicated emotions make us bad people, but they don't. They make us honest. By 5 a.m., faint traces of gray began to creep into the sky outside the window. The world was waking up again. A janitor pushed a cart past the door, humming softly. A doctor's voice echoed down the hallway. The spell of the night was lifting. My father stirred slightly. It was small, almost imperceptible, but his fingers twitched against the hospital sheet. Morella immediately stood, adjusting his oxygen mask and checking his readings. I held my breath, terrified and hopeful all at once. His eyelids fluttered but didn't fully open. Still, it felt like a sign. The morning doctor arrived shortly after and informed me that my father's condition had stabilized. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he was responding. I felt my knees weaken with relief. When I turned to thank Morella, she was gathering her things. The softness in her expression had changed. She looked lighter, as if some invisible weight had shifted. She thanked me instead. She said talking through the night had reminded her why she chose this path in the first place. Not just to administer medicine, but to share humanity in the quiet spaces. Over the next few days, I returned to the hospital during daylight hours. My father gradually regained consciousness. His voice was raspy at first, but his eyes were clear. We had the conversations I had feared we might never have. I apologized for my impatience over the years, for the times I made him feel like a burden. He squeezed my hand and told me he had always known I stayed because I loved him. I also saw Morella during her occasional daytime shifts. We didn't talk as long as we had that first night, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. A shared memory of fluorescent lights and confessions whispered between beeping machines. Weeks later, my father was discharged. He moved slower, leaned more heavily on a cane, but he was home. One bright afternoon, sunlight pouring through the windows of the hardware store, he looked at me and told me it was time for me to think about my own future. He said he didn't want my life to shrink just because his had. That evening, I wrote an email I had been too afraid to send months earlier, applying for a position in another city. I didn't know what would happen, but for the first time in a long time, I felt courage instead of guilt. Before leaving town for an interview, I stopped by the hospital with a small potted plant and a handwritten note for Morella. I thanked her for sitting with me during the loneliest night of my life and for trusting me enough to admit her own loneliness. I told her that sometimes, healing doesn't come from medicine alone. Sometimes it comes from two people choosing not to let each other feel invisible. Months passed. I got the job. I moved, but I visited often. My father managed the store part-time and hired extra help. He sounded stronger every time we spoke on the phone. And one morning, I received a message from Morella. She had enrolled in evening classes to pursue a certification in pediatric care. She said she finally felt brave enough to revisit the dream she once set aside. Life didn't transform into a perfect movie montage. There were still bills, setbacks, and long days. But something fundamental had changed. That single night of shared vulnerability had reminded both of us that even in places built around illness and endings, beginnings are possible. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and comment below. Your engagement helps stories of compassion reach more people who might need them today. And before you go, I have a special request. In the comments, write the word presence if you believe simply being there for someone can change everything. The night nurse once said it was lonely there. But by morning, neither of us felt alone. And sometimes, that is the miracle we don't see coming.